The universe, often considered impartial, has a way of correcting imbalance. In the cycles of cause and effect, every action sends a signal that echoes through the fabric of reality. And while the consequences may not arrive immediately, they eventually return to the source. This isn't poetic justice. It's a pattern, predictable, unspoken, and unavoidable. In countless instances, those who attempted to derail others, who placed obstacles out of envy or pride, end up experiencing the very outcomes they designed for someone else. Not because of retaliation, but because of the natural order, an order that quietly restores itself when left undisturbed. For those observing closely, this moment marks a turning point, especially for individuals often labeled as the chosen, those who, despite adversity, continue rising. Let's unpack how this universal mechanism plays out when truth meets deception, and why those who move in silence ultimately shift the outcome. Power rooted in deception is fragile. It may appear stable, even commanding, but it only exists as long as people believe in the illusion. When falsehoods are revealed, what remains is a hollow shell of influence. Individuals who manipulated narratives, who relied on half-truths and misinformation to maintain status, find themselves exposed not through confrontation, but through a gradual and irreversible unraveling of their credibility. What's important to note is that this unraveling rarely happens dramatically. There's no grand announcement. Instead, the shift begins in subtle ways. The same rooms that once welcomed them begin to grow quiet. Their words, once received with weight, lose their resonance. The applause quiets. Doubt replaces trust. Suspicion replaces admiration. What's most devastating for them isn't the exposure itself, it's the loss of control that follows. Reputations built on secrecy collapse when the silence is broken. And those who once appeared untouchable slowly realize that respect earned through manipulation isn't sustainable. Once people see the truth, it can't be unseen. Often, betrayal is perceived as a personal attack. But in many cases, the motivation isn't the individual, it's the light they carry. Some people are threatened not by actions or words, but by presence alone. A strong sense of direction, inner stability, and an uncompromised identity can become a mirror for those still hiding from their own insecurities. This is especially true for those categorized as chosen ones, people whose inner clarity causes discomfort to those who benefit from illusion. Their consistency, silence, or peace can act as a trigger, simply because it reflects what others lack. Those who engage in silent sabotage often aren't consciously aware that they're reacting to this discomfort. They operate from envy masked as competition. They respond to what they don't understand with passive resistance, gossip, or subtle exclusion. But their actions aren't effective. They reveal more about their own inner discontent than they do about the person they're targeting. In this context, the message becomes clear: never internalize opposition as a reflection of your value. Often, you are not the target, your stability is. In environments where deception thrives, silence becomes a powerful countermeasure. It doesn't indicate weakness. Instead, it signals restraint, clarity, and control. While those who spread misinformation seek reactions to validate their tactics, silence denies them that fuel. In many cases, the individuals behind sabotage rely on drama to retain influence. They aim to provoke responses, spark arguments, or create visible divides. But when their efforts meet indifference, the strategy collapses. The absence of reaction becomes a mirror, reflecting their intentions back to them without interference. Over time, they begin to feel that loss of influence. Not because someone fought back, but because no one engaged. This creates a different kind of consequence, one they weren't prepared for. They didn't just lose a conflict. They lost the illusion that they were in control. It's easy to view isolation as a form of exclusion. When people step away or when support diminishes, the immediate reaction may be to question oneself. However, in many situations, that solitude is a form of clarity. It separates those who are genuinely supportive from those whose loyalty is conditional. What often happens is a reversal. The person who was once isolated emerges, stable and focused. Meanwhile, those who engineered the isolation experience the very loneliness they intended to inflict. This isn't retaliation, it's balance. As narratives shift, so do alliances. Those who once stood against you start losing credibility, and people begin to distance themselves, not because they were asked to, but because energy never lies. The reversal of roles is quiet, but impactful. Isolation is no longer seen as exclusion. It becomes evidence that not everyone is meant to accompany you into the next season. One of the most powerful consequences is self-awareness, when someone is forced to confront the reality they tried to deny. For those who operate from deception, this awareness is destabilizing. Not because others see the truth, but because they finally do. There's no rescue from this stage. Once self-deception collapses, there's no comfort left. The same justifications they once used no longer offer reassurance. The silence becomes suffocating. They begin to understand that the impact wasn't just external, it was internal. The damage wasn't only inflicted on others, it reshaped their own identity. This confrontation with self is the most sobering aspect of the downfall. There's no one left to blame. There's no audience left to perform for. The mask has cracked, and now they must face what's behind it. Downfall, in most cases, doesn't happen in a single moment. It builds quietly, almost imperceptibly, until the structure can no longer hold. While the deceiver believes they are thriving, they are, in reality, undermining themselves. Each lie adds weight. Each manipulation adds instability. When collapse happens, it's thorough. By the time exposure is complete, it's too late to repair the damage. Relationships have frayed. Trust is eroded. The same tactics that once maintained control now provoke rejection. This is not punishment. It is process. It is the natural result of actions misaligned with truth. And the most telling part? The person on the receiving end of their sabotage never had to intervene. Once the consequences become visible, some individuals attempt a return. They reach out not to reconcile, but to survive. They present apologies not rooted in accountability, but in desperation. They're not motivated by remorse, they're reacting to loss. It's important to observe patterns, not promises. True change comes with consistency, not sudden expressions of regret. And often, those seeking to reconnect are not doing so because they value the relationship, they're doing so to reclaim a source of energy they no longer have. This is where discernment is key. Just because someone returns doesn't mean they belong. If exposure removed them, it did so for a reason. If consequences arrived, they did so on schedule. Reopening doors may only repeat cycles. There are individuals who become fixated on the progress of others. They study, observe, and track with the hope of finding weakness. But their attention doesn't fuel transformation, it fuels bitterness. They become distracted from their own goals and instead invest energy into comparison. When you stop engaging with this energy, you reclaim your direction. Their obsession, once seen as pressure, becomes irrelevant. Their attention is no longer fuel, it's evidence that you were never in competition. Progress is not proven through conflict. It's proven through direction. And when you continue building, quietly, steadily, those who tried to define your limits will eventually face theirs. Now, we turn our focus to the aftermath, the long-term implications of exposure, the final movements of karma, and why those once underestimated often become the defining figures in the landscape of truth. In a world where manipulation can sometimes appear to offer temporary results, integrity becomes the long game. When tension arises, people watch, not just the outcomes, but the process. They observe how both sides respond to adversity. And over time, it's not the person with the loudest argument who wins, but the one who remained consistent, principled, and unwavering. Those who plotted against you likely believed their version of reality would be accepted simply because they said it with confidence. But when they were forced to keep performing that narrative under scrutiny, it became unsustainable. People began to notice the contradictions. They remembered the facts. Slowly, they turned their attention not to the drama, but to the behavior of those involved. The one who remained silent, who stayed grounded, who continued to operate with consistency, became the one whose version of events aligned with reality. That's why maintaining integrity, even when falsely accused or targeted, isn't a passive act. It's a strategic one. Because eventually, integrity outlasts strategy that lacks it. Some people fear confrontation. Others fear embarrassment. But the most feared consequence is being quietly written off. No dramatic confrontation. No announcement. Just a slow, irreversible shift in perception. Once people stop trusting someone, there's rarely a conversation, it simply happens. They stop replying. They stop engaging. They choose different alliances. This is the kind of exposure that's most effective. It doesn't require proof. It doesn't rely on storytelling. It only requires time. Eventually, those who were once respected for appearances find themselves isolated. Not by force, but by consequence. And once credibility is lost, regaining it is far more difficult than gaining it for the first time. In these moments, those who once believed they had control often try to compensate, through over-explanation, reinvention, or projection. But the silence of others speaks louder. The room no longer shifts when they enter. The dynamic is changed. The influence is gone. Contrary to common belief, karma doesn't retaliate. It recalibrates. It doesn't seek vengeance. It simply restores order. When someone acts from deception, the return may not be immediate, but it's inevitable. And because karma is not fueled by emotion, it doesn't arrive in dramatic fashion. It arrives in alignment, with precision. For those who attempted to cause harm, the signs of imbalance usually appear subtly. Plans that fail without explanation, opportunities that collapse at the final step, support that evaporates without warning. These aren't coincidences. They are indicators that the energy has shifted. The stability they once enjoyed was built on borrowed time, and that time has expired. The greatest irony is that they often realize this only when it's too late to reverse. They misinterpreted silence as weakness. They saw patience as passivity. But they were mistaken. What looked like inaction was actually positioning. And what felt like control was just borrowed credibility. There was likely a time when those who undermined you moved with great confidence. Their tone was authoritative. Their decisions were bold. Their strategies calculated. But when truth begins to surface, that confidence starts to shift. What once sounded convincing becomes forced. What once seemed fearless begins to look unstable. This isn't always visible from the start. Often, it's in the small cues. Over-explanation, frequent justification, and visible discomfort in previously strong environments. The change isn't in what they say, but how they say it. There's less certainty. More repetition. Fewer listeners. This gradual erosion of presence isn't just embarrassing, it's instructive. It signals to everyone watching that the foundation they stood on was never as strong as it appeared. And while they try to maintain control, they begin to lose it, one subtle misstep at a time. What happens next is not retribution, it's reinforcement. The collapse of deception becomes a message, especially to those who once stood on the sidelines. Observers now understand the risks. They remember who tried to destroy someone quietly, and how that attempt ended in public collapse. The story becomes a warning, not just about deception, but about underestimating integrity. Some who once considered following a similar path now hesitate. They've seen what happens when schemes are exposed. They understand that false strength isn't sustainable. And in that hesitation, a boundary is reinforced, not by confrontation, but by example. You, the person they once targeted, become that example. Not because you fought for it, but because you stood still while everything else fell apart. The silence that once felt isolating has now become a symbol of discernment. The patience that felt heavy has now become the reason others believe you. There's a temptation to expect justice to arrive loudly. We look for it in public moments, dramatic reversals, or legal decisions. But most justice arrives unnoticed. Quietly. Incrementally. It works through relationships, opportunities, and perception. It alters momentum, not headlines. And the result is often more permanent than public drama. Because while dramatic downfalls can be explained away, silent losses cannot. Once influence fades, it cannot be demanded back. Once trust is lost, it cannot be forced to return. And once respect is gone, no narrative can replace it. That's why those who endure the storm without reaction often find themselves protected in ways they never expected. They aren't just cleared of suspicion, they are elevated. Not because they fought harder, but because they moved differently. That difference is what people remember. After deception collapses and exposure has done its work, there is one final truth to recognize: you don't need to explain your growth. The people who dismissed you have already received the message. The ones who overlooked you now understand what they missed. And the ones who sided against you, their silence confirms their recognition. You don't need to return to correct the record. Your presence already corrected it. You don't need to revisit past conflicts. They've already been settled. The very people who once doubted you are now re-evaluating your consistency, your restraint, and your direction. This moment isn't about revenge. It's about acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that is earned through silence is often more impactful than any declaration. Because you didn't fight for power, you became it. In the end, exposure isn't just about what others see, it's about what people cannot deny. The downfall of deception and the preservation of integrity don't happen in separate worlds. They happen on the same timeline, in the same environment, under the same watchful eyes. The difference is how each side moves. And when deception finally falls apart, the silence of the one who was wronged becomes the loudest statement in the room. You were never meant to respond. You were meant to remain. And because you did, you've become the proof that truth doesn't just survive, it wins. At the end of every conflict, after the noise fades and the distractions disappear, what remains is clarity. In a world built on appearances, the weight of truth is often underestimated. Yet it is truth, not manipulation, that has the final word. And those who operate in deception are eventually met with a reality they cannot control: exposure. This is not just a spiritual concept. It is a practical one. Exposure doesn't need spectacle to be effective. In fact, its power lies in subtlety. When someone's influence begins to shrink, when their presence no longer commands trust, when the doors that once opened begin to stay closed, that's exposure. Quiet. Consistent. Permanent. And for those who were targeted, for those who were lied about, undermined, or isolated, this is not a call for retaliation. It's a moment to recognize the long game. You were not removed from certain spaces because you were unworthy. You were preserved. You were not dismissed because you lacked value. You were protected. And when the truth made its way back into the room, it did not need your help. It stood on its own. The people who once questioned your presence now understand your silence. The same individuals who leaned into gossip are now distancing themselves from the ones who started it. And those who were waiting to see how your story would unfold, they are witnessing a different ending than the one your enemies tried to write. Because truth always writes the final chapter. It is easy to underestimate the power of staying still. In a culture that values reaction, silence is often mistaken for weakness. But when used with purpose, silence becomes one of the strongest statements you can make. It protects your dignity. It maintains your energy. And most importantly, it allows deception to collapse under its own weight. By refusing to engage in petty battles, you elevated yourself beyond reach. You didn't argue your value, you demonstrated it through your endurance. You didn't need to expose anyone, life did it for you, in due time. And when that happened, everything shifted. The ones who once appeared in control are now searching for stability. The people who questioned your strength now point to you as the example. The narrative has changed. But your character did not. You stayed rooted in integrity, and now, that integrity is the foundation of your influence. It's important to understand that exposure doesn't just restore your name, it deters future attacks. Those who once considered aligning against you now pause. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. They've seen what happens when truth is dismissed. And they understand what it costs to underestimate someone protected by alignment, not performance. Your life, from this point forward, will serve as quiet evidence of the principle that truth does not need to shout to be heard. It simply needs time. And once it arrives, nothing stands in its way, not lies, not alliances, not appearances. Let this be your reminder, you never needed to prove who you were. You only needed to remain it. The chaos may have been loud, but the conclusion is silent. And in that silence, you've been elevated. Not because of retaliation. Not because of revenge. But because truth made room for you, and cleared out everything that wasn't real. Now, you no longer carry the weight of betrayal. You carry the clarity of survival. Let others take note. Let the story serve as a reminder. And let your next steps be guided not by emotion, but by precision. Because you are not who they said you were. You are who the truth revealed you to be. And now, everyone else finally sees it. If this message resonated with you, if you've experienced the quiet weight of betrayal, the sharp edge of isolation, or the slow unraveling of false narratives, then understand this, you're not alone, and you were never without purpose. What you've endured wasn't meant to break you. It was meant to refine you. Now is the time to move with clarity. To lead, not react. To build, not explain. And most importantly, to protect your peace without compromising your power. The truth has already done its work. You don't need to prove anything to those who were never meant to understand you. So take a moment to acknowledge how far you've come. Then, if you're ready to continue forward with purpose, hit that like button to lock in this alignment. Subscribe to stay connected to powerful insights crafted for those walking the path of truth, clarity, and strength. And in the comments, drop "I move in truth" to affirm your journey. Because moving in silence doesn't mean moving alone. It means moving wisely. More clarity. More confirmation. More elevation, without chaos, is coming. Stay focused. Stay grounded. And above all, stay true.